What's up guys, you're watching Li-Fi TCG. Continuing my series of videos on Pauper decks that have got new cards recently. Today we're going to be looking at blue-white familiars. So I'm going to give a quick rundown of the deck, just generally like how it plays, how it works, and then talk about some of the different card choices, both like the new cards that like everybody's playing that's pretty stock, and also some of the specific choices in the list that I make that's a bit different to what most other people play. So the blue-white familiars deck has existed in Pauper for a very long time. It's a little bit hard to define exactly what kind of deck it is. Everybody would have to agree that it's at least some kind of combo deck. So we can look at how the combo works, would be a good place to start. So one of the key creatures in the deck is the card the deck is named after, Sunscape Familiar. 2 mana white creature, 0/3. Your blue spells cost 1 less to cast. So in general that's very good with every card in the deck, right? Like Modern Age or Mulldrifter or any blue card that costs colorless mana, but it's especially strong with Ghostly Flicker. If you control 2 Sunscape Familiars along with Archaeomancer, your Ghostly Flicker will only cost blue mana, meaning you can cast it targeting Island and Archaeomancer. The island will come back untapped and your Archaeomancer will enter the battlefield, returning your Ghostly Flicker to your hand, and then you can repeat that loop as many times as you want. Now that loop itself doesn't actually achieve anything, you're just casting Ghostly Flicker over and over, but if you have God Pharaoh's Faithful, every time you cast Ghostly Flicker you gain 1 life, and if you have Murmuring Mystic, a recent downshift in Commander Masters, each time you cast Ghostly Flicker you also create a 1/1 flying token. So it's very easy to take over the game with that combo. The other combo you can do, which usually also involves Sunscape Familiar, if you have Ghostly Flicker and 2 Archaeomancers and a Snap, then you cast Snap targeting your opponent's creature, which untaps 2 lands, and then you cast Ghostly Flicker targeting 2 Archaeomancers, bringing back the Ghostly Flicker and the Snap. So Snap potentially only costs 1 blue mana, but it can add 2 blue mana if you untap 2 blue sources. So if you have enough cost reduction from your Sunscape Familiar, or you're untapping Azorius Chancery with the Snap, then this combo is also infinite. So you use the Snap on all your opponent's creatures, they don't have any creatures anymore. Then if you want to cast even more spells to get the triggers from your God Pharaoh's Faithful or your Murmuring Mystic, then you can just start targeting the Snap on the God Pharaoh's Faithful and recasting it again, because you'll be floating excess white mana from your Azorius Chancery. So those are how the infinite combos work. So we all agree that this deck is probably some sort of combo deck, but the thing is that it doesn't really play out like any other type of combo deck. Some people call it a combo control deck, and when you say combo control deck, I think of decks like Scapeshift that are like, the combos themselves are often don't really even involve multiple cards. Scapeshift is almost like a 1 card win the game. Or like Enduring Ideal, similarly, that type of like 1 win button effect, which isn't really how this deck works at all, right? Because as you could see, the infinite combo was so many pieces. Combo control decks also don't generally care about board presence that much, and you really need like your familiar to survive. Another type of deck that is relatively common in Magic is what people think of as creature combo, which could be like Infect, or as a combo dependent version. Maybe a deck like Vizier in Modern, like the Devoted Druid combo deck like that. So in a way, this deck is kind of like that, right? Because you're also dependent on sticking multiple creatures. But at the same time, generally, those type of creature combo decks are very soft to removal. And while you are interested in not having your familiar removed, at the same time you can also play this like very strong value game. Like most of your creatures, including your other combo pieces, they have entered the battlefield value. So if your opponent's trying to play a game plan where they just trade with all your creatures with removal, like generally that's a good situation for you, which is not usually the case when you're playing against a deck like Infect or Devoted Druid or Elves or decks like that. So the other type of deck that you could sort of think of, which is this weird like combo tempo control hybrid, is Splinter Twin. And that's also kind of a valid comparison as well. The thing is though that when your combo pieces don't have flash, you have to play it in a bit of a different way. And also your combo is so many pieces, it's not just A plus B. So it's very hard to like surprise your opponent with a combo win out of nowhere in the way that Splinter Twin was so famous for doing. So how this deck usually wins is you're building up a board presence over multiple turns, and the combo is just the end state of that build up. You make favourable trades over the course of the game, and eventually you've built up to that like undefeatable board. You can combo quickly if your opponent's not interacting with you at all, but it's much harder to do that in this deck compared to something like Twin or Vizier. Firstly, because your combo requires so many more pieces, and secondly, because you don't really have any way to search for stuff. So yeah, it's a very, very unique deck. Often when people look at it and see a deck list and they've never played against it before, it's very hard to sort of figure out how it plays just by looking at it. So with all that in mind, let's get into the deck list. So we have the 4 Familiar, which we've already talked about. A very critical combo piece, and it just makes every spell in your deck much more efficient. 3 Archaeomancer as part of your combo, and also just as a value creature, especially with Ephemerate. That loop is one of the most broken things you can do in Pauper, not only in this deck but also in the Tron decks or the Jeskai Ephemerate decks. It's one of the strongest value engines in the format. Ephemerate plus a creature that brings it back into the battlefield. Just like in most decks, like in Tron for example, like 3 of this effect is a good number, because in the late game it's what you want to find. Like I said, it's the end point of that board state you're trying to build up. But early in the game it costs 4 mana, and it doesn't really do anything if you don't have good targets for it in the graveyard. So the compromise is to only play 3 copies, and that's pretty stock. The infinite combo outlets we've already talked about, the God Pharaoh's Faithful and the Murmuring Mystic. Murmuring Mystic is surprisingly strong downshift. Before, if you wanted to play this kind of infinite outlet that actually won the game, as opposed to this, which just gains life, you had to play either Sage's Row Denizen or Iceberg Cancrix, which, like, when you're doing the loop, it decks them out. And as a combo win con, like, decking them out is actually better because it doesn't give them a chance to untap and kill you. Like in a combo mirror, that could matter. But overall, in most matchups, Memory Mystic is much better, because in board states where you don't have the infinite yet, creating a token on every instant or sorcery you cast is a lot better than incidentally like milling your opponent for a few cards. So yeah, it's very easy to stabilize in matchups versus like blue decks. I mean the like Delver style decks with Tolarian Terror and stuff, or versus like Boros for example, when you make a 1/1 blocker every spell that you play. So that's a very strong downshift for this deck. I like to play one. If you want to play on like super hard mode, you don't technically need this, once you have the infinite life, you can just start flickering your Mulldrifters in that to draw cards, and eventually you'll have the combo where you snap all your opponent's creatures and you can just win by attacking. So technically the Memory Mystic is not strictly necessary, but I do like to have it, and especially if you're playing in paper, having a way to make a lethal board in one turn for clock reasons is valuable as well. So yeah, the Ephemerate we just talked about, one of the strongest value engines in any Pauper deck that can make use of it. Great combo with Mulldrifter too. Mulldrifter is just like the perfect card for this deck. It gives you a blocker, it gives you an attacker, draws a bunch of cards, great synergy with Ephemerate as well. Sunscape reduces it. Yep, it's basically like the perfect card, one of the strongest blue cards in Pauper still. Snap we've also talked about. Just a very strong removal spell. Like Vapor Snag has been playable in Standard at times. Probably the last time like a literal unsummon has been playable, but it's different when you have the effect for 0 mana, or even a lot of the time this is ramping you mana. If you cast it with Sunscape out, it's ramping you mana. Every Azorius Chancery you untap with it, that's an additional mana. Because remember, the way the deck plays, just over time you're trying to build up that board state, and eventually you'll get to a point where you have infinite resources, more than the opponent. So the fact that you wasted a card to just bounce something is okay, like that fits in as part of your plan, and it's just a really, really efficient way to do that. So yeah, Snap's a really strong card. There are some people only like to play 3 Snap, because there's definitely matchups that are very, very grindy where unsummon is not very good. Like you don't really want to bounce, say, your opponent's Phyrexian Rager with it. I mean, obviously that is not really a card you should be too worried about, but initiative creatures, things like that, they're not the best targets to bounce. So some people only play 3 Snap. I still like 4 just because it's so powerful when it is good, and it's very efficient. Worst case scenario, you just have to target one of your own into the battlefield creatures, which is a little bit susceptible to removal, but yeah, generally fine. So I like playing 4 Snaps still. Talk about the mana base now, maybe. So as with a lot of decks in Pauper recently, this deck has gotten a boost from the cycling cards from Lord of the Rings. So we're playing the blue one here, Lorien Revealed. As with Mulldrifter, it's easily castable. You have Sunscape Familiar to reduce it, and you're trying to play to the late game anyway. You can ramp into it with Snap, all of that kind of thing. Previously, the deck used to play like a similar number of shuffle effects. You would play like 4 Ash Barrens and 2 Terramorphic Expanse or whatever, so you'd have a similar number of like come in to play tapped fetch lands. So it hasn't really changed the mana base too much. You've got to play 1 Idyllic Beachfront, or I guess you can play the snow version of this from Kaldheim if you want, just so you can have a way to cycle your Lorien Revealed for a white source. But you don't want to play more than 1 because it slows you down too much. But yeah, 1 Idyllic Beachfront. Some people don't like to play 4 Azorius Chancery, because it's a bit clunky in multiples and it's a bit weak versus land destruction as well. But I think it's an effect that you really want. Like usually it is a strong thing to be able to play 2 of these in one game. You don't really want to play more than 2, because like Snap only untaps 2 lands. By that point in the game you probably have all the money you need anyway. But yeah, it's always an effect that you want to draw, almost always, but yeah, I just think it's nice to have all 4. The Mortuary Mire, just a good like recursion engine, so it means you don't have to worry about all your Archaeomancers dying, and not having any way to get them back, or can just get a Mulldrifter back for value. it's a land, which means you can target it with Ghostly Flicker, meaning as long as you have the Flicker Archaeomancer together with the Mortuary Mire, you can never deck out. You can just keep flickering the Mortuary Mire to recycle your creatures back into your deck. And you can also just pick up the Mortuary Mire with the Azorius Chancery trigger. So yeah, it just makes it a lot harder for some matchups to grind you out. And then the basics is just this split you want to play. 2 planes because you have like white sideboard cards, and there's enough situations you want to cast 2 white spells in one turn, like Ephemerate plus Familiar or something like that. But yeah, of course, mostly islands because the deck's mostly blue. 3 Ash Barrens, 3 Lorien Revealed. I used to play, I was testing 4 Lorien Revealed when it came out, but I trimmed it down and added another Ash Barrens back. Usually in the late game, the deck can get like quite flooded on card draw. It's relatively hard for this deck to be empty-handed, so you don't cast Lorien Revealed as much as you might think. And Ash Barrens just gives you slightly better hands in the early game because you can bounce it with Chancery. Like Barrens Chancery is like a kind of playable hand, where Lorien Revealed Chancery just doesn't do anything. So I'm slightly in favour of more Ash Barrens. And if you ask me like where I would be leaning, like I think this is good probably, but I would much prefer to play 4 Ash Barrens, 2 Lorien Revealed than go back to play 2 Ash Barrens, 4 Lorien Revealed. Like 4 Lorien Revealed is too many, I think. So yeah, that's all the mana base. Then for the modern age, so when how should I talk about this card? So for a long time the Familiars deck played Seagate Oracle in this kind of slot. You just wanted some extra early creature to provide value and stabilize the board a bit. And Seagate Oracle, the 3 mana 1/3 sleight of hand when it enters the battlefield. For a long time that was the best effect you could play in that slot. And it was quite fine, it blocks Ninja of the Deep Powers in that. But the modern age I think is much stronger. The fact that it's bigger, it's a 2/3. It has flying, it's also extremely relevant. Like it trades with Delver, it blocks Glinthawk, it blocks Core Skyfisher. All of these are so much more important for like stabilizing. It's much better at attacking as well. In the games where you're like snapping their creatures and just beating down with Mulldrifter, like Modern Age fits into that plan so much better. Like the Seagate Oracle can't attack into a Thraben Inspector. Like the stats on it are just much weaker. Very importantly, this is only 2 mana rather than 3. It's not card advantage by itself, and Seagate Oracle is, but you have enough ways in the deck to offset that. You have so much card draw, you have Mulldrifter, you have Lorien, you have the Deep Analysis. So yeah, overall, Modern Age, I think is much better. The fact that it's not a flicker target is an issue for decks that play a lot of copies of Ghostly Flicker, because sometimes you draw Ghostly Flicker and you have no flicker targets, and you don't want your Ghostly Flicker to be dead. But we're only playing 1 flicker, so that's less of a problem. Some people play 2 flickers, but I'm not, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah, so I think the Modern Age is really good. Just being able to have more good plays on turn 2. You have Familiar, you have this. And then the combo with Deep Analysis is really strong as well. So Deep Analysis is just a good card for the deck by itself. You have life gain built into your deck already, so usually paying 3 life to flashback it is manageable. Because it is a flashback card, the Sunscape discounts it twice. Like if you think of it as a 6 mana draw 4, that's already not too bad for Pauper. But 6 mana draw 4 that your opponent has to interact with twice because of the flashback. And then because you're casting it twice, the single Familiar reduces the cost twice as well. So the top right corner 3 in a blue becomes 2 and a blue, and then your flashback becomes just blue. So then it becomes a 4 mana draw 4, which is really, really good. It's so hard for decks to grind you out when you have that option available to you. And in most games you actually don't want to do that, because paying the full cost for hard casting it is too slow. And that's why it's so good with Modern Age, because draw a card, discard a card, you can just discard your deep analysis, use the flashback mode straight away, make sure you hit all your land drops. Even if you just need to hit your 3rd land drop, it can help you do that. Find an interaction for your opponent or whatever. Yeah, it's just a really, really strong combo together. I tested 4 and 4 for a while, like 4 Modern Age, 4 Deep Analysis. But I wanted like extra slots for other effects, and 4 Deep Analysis can be a bit clunky sometimes. Like if you have a bunch of Modern Ages in your hand, that's fine. It's just more efficient creatures you can keep casting. Like, you're not sad that it's not card advantage when you have so many other effects in your deck that compensate for that. But if you have a hand that's like all deep analysis, that's going to be very hard to do anything with. So I think 4 and 3 is a good split, and I think that's pretty similar to what other people are playing to. Other people might even have less deep analysis than this, but I think this is good. Then on to the next few cards. So we have the 1 Ghostly Flicker, of course, as part of the combo. Don't really need to say much about that. We have 2 counterspells. So it was very common in the past for people to play all Prohibit as their counterspell in Familiars. Of course, actual counterspell is legal in Pauper. Tron decks don't play actual counterspell that much because it's hard for their mana base to cast it. They don't have this many islands, but we do have a lot of islands. The reason why Familiars doesn't necessarily want to play counterspell is because you don't cost reduce it off the familiar. Like, it just costs blue, so there's no generic mana to get the reduction. So that's why people often played Prohibit in Familiars. Some people are off Prohibit now, they are playing actual counterspell. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of expensive cards that Prohibit can't hit. Prohibit only hits targets that are up to 4 mana. So specifically big Cascade creatures and initiative creatures, Prohibit can't answer, and it's crucial that your counterspells can answer those type of creatures because they're very bad targets for snap. Like, you don't want to be bouncing these back to your opponent's hand either. So a lot of people are now on actual counterspell. So I'm not. I'm on Memory Lapse, which has the upside of both that Sunscape Familiar reduces it because it costs 1 and a blue, and it can counter any target. I think this is very strong. Of course, it has the downside that your opponent will just redraw the thing again. And it's relatively easy for the deck to get around that. The first thing is that if your opponent plays a Cascade creature, you could Memory Lapse the creature before the Cascade trigger resolves. Then it will go to the top of their library and they'll Cascade past it. So in that regard, it's basically just is counterspell versus Cascade creatures. If your opponent top decks the creature again, in a lot of situations you have Ephemerate to get the Memory Lapse. You can just Memory Lapse their creature again. They don't get anywhere, and they're usually spending more mana per turn than you on this, if it's something like Avenging Hunter or whatever. And then the other thing is that, like, if your opponent redraws that creature, they have nothing else going on. You can draw stat Piracy Charm them to get rid of it. So you have other ways to answer the stuff that they're redrawing. So yeah, I think because of those reasons, I prefer playing Memory Lapse rather than Counterspell. Just having your counterspells be able to be reduced by the familiar is so strong. Playing normal counterspell in comparison just feels too clunky. So yeah, that's the counterspells. I'm also playing one Meeting of Minds and one Merchant Scroll. I think Merchant Scroll in Familiars is amazing. The first reason is that, like, in the late game, Ghostly Flicker is what you want, right? And that's how all of your infinites work. And it's also can just be a very strong value spell to flicker your Mulldrifters and things. But it's very situational, right? It only does things if you have a board built up already. So in the early game and often in the mid game, it's a very bad top deck. You don't want to play too many copies of it. So the way to sort of thread the needle on that is to play only one copy of Ghostly Flicker and play ways to search for it. And again, this is the perfect mana cost for the Familiars deck, 1 and a blue. Searching your deck for a card for only 1 mana is excellent. And not only does it get the flicker, it's also additional copies of either of your counterspells, whichever one you think is more appropriate for the situation. It can just be snap or even a cantrip if you need it to be. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily play more than one. It's because your effects are all like very narrow. Like, you're not often going to have a use for more than one, and it's going to be very clunky, especially in a situation where you don't have a familiar to be casting more than one of this effect. But effectively doubling your Ghostly Flicker count without having the drawback of the risk of drawing redundant Ghostly Flickers is strong enough by itself. Yeah, I think this card's amazing for familiars. I'm surprised more other people don't play it. Then I'm playing one copy of Meeting of Minds. This is partly in the deck just to have a draw to target for your Merchant Scroll, but it's a very strong card for familiars as well. So this is just like an inspiration with Convoke, but that means familiar basically cost reduces it twice, because you get the mana reduction from the familiar effect and you can tap it for the Convoke. You can have this, which convokes it too. When you flicker your Archaeomancer, it comes back untapped, and then you can convoke again. When you're casting stuff, you get blue tokens that convoke, in sort of mid to late game situations, this can draw like a million cards very fast. So it's just nice to have, but similar to Ghostly Flicker, it doesn't really do anything until you've built up a big board, so like it's very strong when you're popping off, but you don't really want to build your deck assuming you're going to be in that situation all the time. So yeah, I just have one copy, and I think it's fine for that. Then the last few cards, the Piracy Charm, we've already talked about a little bit. So the Island Walk mode doesn't really matter. Like, the best case scenario for that is you give your Archaeomancer Island Walk and you steal your opponent's Monarch emblem or something, but that's basically never going to come up. You only mostly care about it for the +2/-1 modes and the player discards a card mode. So +2/-1 is quite interesting because blue-white, especially in Pauper, doesn't have access to that kind of very efficient removal. And there's a lot of like cheap creatures that die to this that you otherwise don't really have efficient answers to. So I'm thinking of things like Arbor Elf, Courier and Ranger, these type of cheap creatures that snowball pretty hard. And the thing about those creatures is that they're often quite bad targets for snap, because your opponent can just replay them for only 1 mana. They don't really get delayed too much. So having a kind of blue lava dart in your deck gives you like an angle that the deck otherwise doesn't really have access to. And again, you can Merchant Scroll for it in situations that are like clutch. The other thing is that the Piracy Charm, the Raven's Cry mode, is quite strong. Instant speed when your opponent is like hellbent, you can just Piracy Charm their draw step, and then Ephemerate the Piracy Charm back, and it basically locks them out for the entire game. And like, you might think that's like kind of magical Christmas land, or if your opponent was already hellbent and you had Ephemerate Archaeomancer, you probably would be winning anyway. And that's true, but in general I think it's just quite nice that you have a thing that lets you force a resource trade with your opponent, because a lot of the time in sort of like mid-game situations you do have like your Mulldrifter or your Archaeomancer online already, but you don't necessarily have a way to stop what your opponent's doing or setting up, especially if they don't play into your counterspells. Like if you look at the whole entire deck, like the only cards in your deck that actively trade resources with the opponent are these three. So depending on your opponent's strategy, if they're content to just sort of sit on their hand for a while and build up a like big turn to blast through your counterspells, that can be a weakness for the Familiars deck actually. Because if your opponent chooses to play that way, then your only option at that point is to try and race for your combo and infinite kill them. But that takes a lot of resources and it's not always the easiest thing to do quickly. So just having this option to like force your opponent to discard a few cards instead of like Archaeomancering your Brainstorm back and just like spinning your wheels a bit, having that tactical option available to you I think is quite strong for this deck. Yeah, it lets you do a thing that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. But in saying that, I do think this is like the weakest card, or you can think of it as like the 60th card. If you think this idea is really dumb, I would just add the 4th God Pharaoh's Faithful back into the deck. I'm not gonna get in a big argument about it. Like I don't think it's gonna like revolutionize the format or anything. I just think it's quite strong and it's an interesting card to try. Then finally we have these 4 cards. Like if you've just stumbled onto my channel from like my legacy videos or something, well, I mean that's not very likely, but in that case you would probably say, yeah, of course your deck's playing Brainstorm. I mean, you're playing a blue deck in a format with Brainstorm, why would you not play for Brainstorm? But of course the Pauper players will know that people don't generally play Brainstorm in this deck, they play Preordain instead, because in Pauper players generally have the mentality, whether it's correct or not, that Brainstorm is too much of a liability in a format where you don't have fetch lands as free shuffle effects. Like you do have shuffle effects, you have Ash Barrens and you have Lorien Revealed and you have Merchant Scroll even qualifies as a shuffle effect. But people don't like the having to sequence around Brainstorm in a way where you have to spend an extra mana on these, compared to the other shuffle effects in like Legacy and Modern where you just have Flooded Strand or Scalding Tarn that shuffle your deck for no mana. And I think that's like valid to a point, but I just think Brainstorm is too strong, especially in this deck where you have Azorius Chancery. like yes, the deck does need 4 to 5 mana to do whatever it wants, you know, like hardcast Mulldrifter, hardcast Archaeomancer, but you don't need 4 to 5 lands in play. Like you're not killing your opponent with Valakut or whatever. Like you can just have your 4 to 5 mana off 3 lands and Brainstorm your extra lands away. Like it's a very strong thing that the deck is able to do. And the other thing is that in the sort of like mid game, because your deck draws so many cards indiscriminately, right? You have Deep Analysis, which just says draw a billion cards. You have Ephemerate Mulldrifter, which just says draw a billion cards. But a lot of those cards are going to be lands. You might think, well, that's not so bad. I mean, if I'm drawing a billion cards, then I should be good anyway, right? But the issue is that the way that you actually win the game, building up towards that end state of that infinite combo that, you know, we explained at the start, requires so many pieces, right? You need like at least one familiar, sometimes two. You need to have at least one Archaeomancer, sometimes two. You got to have like the infinite outlet thing that actually does a thing when you cast Ghostly Flicker a million times. So, like, yes, you're drawing a ton of cards, but like there's a good chance that that ton of cards just isn't enough cards. And in that case, like being able to take the top three of your deck and put back two like useless lands that you've probably drawn in your stack of cards that you just drew, like it's not win more or overkill. Like it's the difference between like fizzling out and getting run over versus like having all the gas to like keep going and play out your combo. Yeah, so for that reason, I think Brainstorm is very good. Like, of course, I have to admit that on like turn one, if you're trying to dig for lands, then this can just be like a ponder that doesn't shuffle, basically, right? So in that case, when you're digging for lands, of course you would rather have Preordain or even actual ponder. Like, I can't deny that, but I would just tell you that you should mulligan to hands that have two lands in them, right? Like, are you going to mulligan slightly more than a deck that has Preordain here? Like, probably. But I would say that Brainstorm is so strong in the mid-game and that this deck recovers extremely well from mulligans when you have stuff like this available, that I don't really care. Like, I would just happily mulligan slightly more, draw all my cards on like turn 3 to 5, and then cast Brainstorm and gas back up again. Like, yeah, I mean, maybe I'm like off my rocker here, or like have the wrong idea, basically, because if you look at all the lists from the top placings in the tournaments, everybody's playing Preordain. You know, and these are obviously people that know that Brainstorm exists, and at some point they've probably tried it. But yeah, overall I just can't understand it. I think Brainstorm is fantastic for this deck. But yeah, I've basically said everything about it that I can. So that's the main deck, and I'll talk about the sideboard a bit quickly. So obviously I have too many cards in my sideboard right here. I have 19 cards in my sideboard. So it's pretty stock for people to play like about 4 Hydroblast. Of course you can play more if you want, because Blue Elemental Blast is legal in the format as well. But Burn is obviously a very popular deck in Pauper at the moment, especially with, well, ever since Swiftspear got downshifted and all of the Reckless Impulse effects exist. So like, this is a very scary card for Burn to play against, but all the rest of your deck, like as I pointed out before, you don't actually have that much interaction at all in your main deck. So in games where you don't have this, it's very, very easy for you to just spin your wheels for a few turns while Burn kills you. So you do need at least a decent number of answers in your sideboard. Then also people play a lot of Dust to Dust in their sideboard as well. It's one of the strengths of being a white deck in Pauper, is that you have this versus the affinity stuff. I'm not sure if the All That Glitters deck is like a flavor of the month, or if that's actually good too, but people are playing that a bit at the moment as well. But even just versus the normal version of Affinity, like the Grixis version that's been popular for ages, this is probably one of the best cards you can play. And Revoke Existence, similarly, if you just want like extra Dust to Dust, or if you also want to have a way to kill enchantments, then this is probably the best option. Some people also play Nature's Chant, which is like a hybrid green-white disenchant effect. So instant is better than sorcery, but it says destroy rather than exile, which is the downside compared to this. And another nice thing about that card is because it's hybrid green, Sunscape reduces it, because don't forget Sunscape also reduces green spells. So yeah, that's the other option people play, but usually people play like 4 to 6 copies of artifact / enchantment destruction. And then another card that I'm playing in my sideboard, this is a bit of my like own technology, is this Loyal Sentry. So in a way this is just like a 1 mana white death touch creature, like Typhoid Rats in white. When it blocks, both creatures die. So one thing this is very good against right now is the mono blue, because obviously it doesn't block Delver of Secrets, but all the rest of the creature suite in that deck is like Tolarian Terror and Cryptic Serpent. So not only do those cards not have any evasion, so they're going to be attacking into your Loyal Sentry, like Tolarian Terror also has Ward, so it's not easy to target it with anything. And like in the entire Pauper card pool, there's not very many good actual removal spells that you could even target Tolarian Terror with. I mean, especially in blue-white, like you can't play Swords to Plowshares or anything, obviously. So this is just a very efficient creature versus big creatures that have no evasion, and that's a very popular part of the format right now. The other thing that this is really good against, which is not quite so obvious, is Ponza, I think. Now, the reason for that is similarly just to like the Tolarian Terror logic. Like it's not quite so apparent. Like they have these really big creatures in their deck, like Avenging Hunter, Boarding Party, Annoyed Altasaur. Like they deal so much damage to you that God-Fearer's Faithful is not going to help you that much, gaining a few life. You don't want to snap them back to their hand because they have great effects for the opponent every time they cast them again. So it's like, well, what are you going to do about them? Like, and not to mention they're like land destructioning your stuff. So you want your answer to be really, really efficient. Loyal Sentry is just one of the best options. So, yeah, so like how it plays is you get one of these down early, and then they play like a Cascade creature or a initiative guy, and then rather than you being immediately under pressure from that, for 1 mana you've like made the trade already. So it's not going to immediately stabilize you the game if they follow up with more Cascade stuff, or if they have more gas, then you might be in trouble. But just giving you that little bit of extra breathing room, especially versus that deck that's trying to like spam out all its gas as soon as possible and just steamroll you over, I think it helps a lot, because like that deck, if it curves out, is very scary, but it has a lot of really bad top decks in it because it has to play enough lands to hit all its land drops, but it's also playing like Utopia Sprawl and Arbor Elf and stuff that's really weak in the mid to late game. So often if you just survive their initial burst, then you're a like blue deck with Brainstorm and card draw and everything, you can like claw your way out of it. So yeah, I think that's quite good, because Pons is one of the worst matchups for this deck as well, because you want to make all your land drops and you're playing bounce lands as well. So anything that helps versus that is pretty good. The other thing too to note is that it's good versus Trample, which matters versus Altasaur and Avenging Hunter, because the trigger happens before damage, so your opponent's creature won't deal any damage and they won't trample over. The other thing that's also worth noting is that you can flicker this with the trigger on the stack, and then their creature will still be destroyed, but your Loyal Sentry is a new object, so it comes back and survives, which isn't like a totally game deciding play, right? Because it just means that you're trading your flicker effect for their creature rather than your Loyal Sentry. But it's nice to have that option. It just lets you trade with another thing if you're under a lot of pressure. So yeah, I think this card's quite good. worth keeping in mind. I don't know how many you would actually play, but it's generally quite good in the options in those matchups where like Snap and Godfarrow's Faithful are both not great. The other thing compared to Faithful is that this has a power, which means that like it's just a 1/1 that you can like snap their blocker and then take the initiative or take the Monarch, which is quite interesting too. So yeah, still not exactly sure how many of these I would play, but I definitely think it's a pretty decent card at the moment. Circular Protection Blue, this is a quite strong card right now. Like I said, the Tolarian Terror Cryptic Serpent Delver Secrets deck obviously has a really hard time beating this. Mono Blue's not going to have Enchantment Destruction. They basically have to try and Echoing Truth this back to your hand and then counter it again on the way back down. So if you want a card to like slam the door on that matchup, this is the best one at the moment. Then I think the deck does want to have some sort of like hard removal spell in its sideboard. In the mirror, it's very good to be able to kill your opponent's familiars versus Axebane Guardian. That deck, like bouncing their stuff isn't going to keep you alive for that long. That deck is a bit faster than you, so that's the thing, we want removal as well. So the two best options for this I think are Inside Out and Last Breath. Inside Out, of course, in Pauper, most well known for the Tireless Tribe combo, but it also just kills creatures that have no power. And of course Sunscape has no power. Most of the creatures in the Walls deck have no power, so this is just a hard removal spell in those matchups, and it's because it's blue, it's searchable of Merchant Scroll, which is extremely relevant for any sideboard card you could consider playing. Having extra copies by Merchant Scroll matters a lot. But if you want a more generic removal spell, like you want extra options versus Kessig Flame Breather or random aggro decks or things like that, then you can just play Last Breath. So it doesn't get cost reduced by Familiar. You can't search it with Merchant Scroll, but it just hits a much wider variety of targets. And in a pinch, you can target your own stuff if you want to gain life. So yeah, I would probably recommend in the sideboard having at least one copy of either of these, but depending on the meta you expect, you can decide which one. Then another few cards in the sideboard, like Exclude or Negate, these kind of generic counterspells, lose focus. It's just, you need to be sort of aware that like there are matchups where Snap is bad because it's grindy and you don't want to unsummon your opponent's creatures because they have beneficial cast triggers or enter the battlefield triggers, and also because Godfarrow's Faithful is not very good because they're not going to be pressuring you that much that you don't need it, or because their creatures are so big that this doesn't block anything and they're going to be like chunking you down in big damage hits, so the like life gain ultimately doesn't matter that much. So like in a matchup where both of those things were true, like combo deck or grindy deck or whatever, then that's like a lot of cards you would potentially be boarding out. So that might not be a blue deck, it might not be an artifact deck. So in that situation, you want to be able to make sure you have enough cards to board in. So often people in the sideboard of Familiars do have that kind of very generic effect. Like you could board Loyal Sentry in technically, but I mean it's just a 1/1, that's not that exciting. So usually people will have like Exclude or Negate or another type of counterspell like this, just to make the numbers sort of all line up. So again, because I haven't finalized this yet, I don't have like an exact configuration for you to play, but like if you're going to play the deck yourself, that's what you have to be able to answer. Your sideboard plan in the different matchups has to be able to account for that. Yeah, and the last card I haven't talked about here is just this Geist Wave. So a bounce spell is like a reasonable card to play either main deck or sideboard. Like you could play a bounce spell main deck over the Piracy Charm, for example. It's sort of competing with the like remove enchantment / artifact spell as well. Yeah, usually people will play Echoing Truth, which is a bit it's understandable because it's good versus like the Cold Oath tokens and things like that, but you do often bounce your own stuff to protect it from removal, and this just has an upside if you do that, while also like still answering your opponent's Journey to Nowheres and things like that. So yeah, this type of effect is not 100% essential, but good to be aware of. So either Geist Wave or Echoing Truth is the best. This is like a grindy loop with Archaeomancer, because you just bounce your own Archaeomancer, draw a card, cast your Archaeomancer, get the Geist Wave back. Echoing Truth can do that too, kind of, with Archaeomancer if you have two of them. Just bounce into Archaeomancers, get the Echoing Truth back, get something else back. So yeah, that's not really like either of the main reasons to play the card, but it's just a funny thing to be aware of. And I think that will be about it for my discussion of this deck. I definitely get a lot of enjoyment out of playing this deck. Of course, as you will know if you are a regular viewer of my channel, I have made a lot of videos on the Tron deck in Pauper in the past, which is similarly like a kind of Ghostly Flicker late game combo deck. But this, I think Familiars, I find is slightly more fun to play, just because you have like way more efficient spells. You have better cantrips, so your draws are smoother. It's just a little bit more interesting to play. It gives you a bit of that like Splinter Twin feel, which is definitely a fan favorite type of strategy to be using. So yeah, it's one of my favorite Pauper decks at the moment. So let me know what you think, especially the Brainstorm is probably the most controversial option here. Brainstorm, the Piracy Charm, and the Loyal Sentry, I think, is the interesting takeaways from this video. Everything else is relatively stock. Version Scroll might not be stock, but I'm saying it should be stock. It's too good. That's the hill I will die on. Yeah, time to stop rambling. I think this has been Life by TCG with Pauper Blue White Familiars. Signing out.